We're going to focus on what more we can expect from tomorrow's conference now between France, the UK and other nations with Dr. Bamo Nouri, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of West London. Bamo, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. It appears that for any potential coalition to work, it would need to coordinate with countries on the Strait, including Iran. If this coalition needs Iran's blessing to operate in the Strait, is that actually realistic? Will it get Iran's blessing?
It's a bit of a complicated one because looking at the UK and France mission in the Strait, I'd say it's less about changing the actual course of the conflict and more about signaling a presence, credibility, and even intent from both countries that kind of to this point have almost been sidelined out of the conflict in terms of influence. At one level, you've obviously got the issue of the freedom of navigation through this really critical corridor. But on a deeper level, I think this is more about Europe's attempt to reinsert itself into a crisis that has been essentially shaped by US and Israeli decision-making in a war of choice, and then Iran later in a more existential context. So after diplomatic tracks have obviously not worked at the beginning, even the ones involving European mediation, despite their viability, this is something that I've kind of looked at in my own work of late. This war wasn't inevitable. It followed the abandonment of diplomacy at a moment when off-ramps still existed. So when you look at it in that particular context, it's not as much about whether Iran will play ball or not. It's kind of looking at exactly what the purpose of this mission in particular is and what the kind of long-term effects of this will be. So I'd say it's more about restoring some sort of diplomatic relevance and demonstrating that Europe still has a stake in regional order. And at the same time, you have to also kind of say that it's coming at a very, very different period of the conflict, the mediation that's being offered now. So on the one hand, we know that what was presumed to be an easy military campaign for the US and Israel and regime change in Iran, that hasn't happened. Instead, now we're in this kind of stalemate where those expectations have essentially been exposed and the conflict is at more of a kind of uncertain equilibrium. And that being said, it's very difficult to then be able to say at this point whether it will reach any further beyond the signaling that is kind of going to be probably the dominant element of it.
Well, it's kind of hard to see this plan materializing without the key player, President Donald Trump. British officials are reportedly worried that cutting Trump out of these plans will anger him, while French officials say that involving him will then mean they might not get the approval from Iran to operate in the Strait. How do France and Britain walk that tightrope and without alienating either side?
Well, there's always a role and space for diplomacy. There's no doubt about that. I think in this particular context, there's no doubt that it's more effective than military intervention that was kind of planned and talked about or escalating things further. And at this point, I think America probably more than it lets on welcome the fact that these two powers are getting involved, two powers that still have a credible line and relationship with Iran. And this is probably the closest approach that will reflect the reality on the ground. You can easily say this conflict for America has reached a point where further military action is going to produce more diminishing returns and at the same time increasing risks of wider escalations. Now, I've consistently argued this in my own work of late that warnings that military force would essentially backfire, and even recently about the ceasefire, that these initiatives have actually strengthened Iran's position. So for America, this could be a really welcome kind of strategy and off-ramp if they're to also endorse it, because up to now, nothing else is working. Let's be kind of honest about that. Iran's strategy is calculated endurance rather than the rapid escalation that came from the US-Israeli side. It's chosen to absorb, it's responded selectively, and leveraged its geographic and political advantages to offset these conventional military asymmetries and approaches. So this is a position where Iran's not only sustained attacks, but also exposed the limits of and also contradictions of US and Israeli strategy. So at this point, this is more welcome than many actually understand. And I'd also add to that that the US still remains the most powerful actor in the region and in this context because of its sheer power. That doesn't mean that this kind of approach doesn't need America. It definitely needs America to also kind of be part of the willing, and also if there is any sort of agreement, that America plays a part in guaranteeing and adhering to it. And I think the other thing to consider is obviously Israel's role in this particular context and how much America plays a part in that. And this is why when you look at this recent announcement by Britain and France to actually get involved, it's coming at a really important juncture, which is a stalemate. The US obviously can project power anywhere it wants, but it can't translate that power into a decisive political outcome. And this is where, in this particular context, it's not about dominance, it's really about constraint. And any sort of diplomacy and de-escalation is not only welcome at this point, I think it's more than essential.
Well, Bamo, I do want to get your perspective on the timing of all of this, because while, you are saying that this would be welcomed, this coalition, is it fair to say that this is a little bit too late? Because we're having European allies now planning for a post-ceasefire mission. Should they be acting more now? I mean, we've of course had Trump's calls for them to help the US in blockading the Strait of Hormuz. Have they missed the moment, when Trump was really pushing for that harder line? Should they have come to the US's aid?
Not necessarily, because the approach at the beginning was escalation above constraint, and that escalation was absorbed by Iran. And we've now seen what the aftermath and the effects of that are in the short term, with guaranteed projections in the long term. And the problem at the beginning was that we'd entered this war off the back of a failed diplomatic mission and an escalation by two parties, or one party that was part of the negotiation team with Iran in the first place. So when you look at it from that context, you kind of can see also in the alternate angle that we are now bringing Europe into the equation at a time when, frankly, we're at a kind of stalemate. We now have two blockades, almost like a blockade for another blockade. America's in a situation where it needs to be able to demonstrate some sort of control over the conflict, and this is where this second blockade has come from. Otherwise, on every other level of what should happen now, if the strait remains closed, the repercussions are immeasurable, literally. And if nothing can be done or is to be done, then nothing will change. And I think the timing that this has come is at a time when clearly there needs to be a revision of strategy. There needs to be a kind of rethink, and maybe a fresh pair of eyes on the situation is probably going to have more of a positive impact than the kind of three parties that continue to be escalating or bringing things to a stalemate.
Well, I do want to ask you a final question. We're running out of time, Bamo, but I want to ask you about how relations have soured between Europe and US President Donald Trump. There's been a notable shift from European allies sort of treating Trump with flattery, flattering him in the hopes that he will move towards a more productive approach, in the war. Talk to us about that notable shift and whether that's the right kind of diplomacy that the European allies should be having with Trump. Does that work?
Well, what's not going to work is escalations with a power that is designed to absorb and designed to basically cause its own version of or strategy, which is quite destructive for the global economy. For the European allies, you have to put it into context. Europe, on kind of a single state level, if you look at the individual states, the key players, even within the G7, they don't have the appetite or the capacity for a full-blown, what would be a forever war at this particular juncture. America's predicament is completely different because it's got access to such an arms industry. Going to war is a whole different kind of question, setup, dynamic for them. And I think for Europe, the best thing it could do in this particular juncture is keep diplomacy as a kind of first channel, which is what it should be anyway in the post 1945 world order, with the UN and all of these kind of international laws at the forefront of state conduct. And I think Europe, many dismiss this approach as passive. Some European powers, a bit too extreme. Some even seen as pandering to Donald Trump. But the reality is, this was a war that started without strategy. And if there's no clear strategy, it's very difficult then to achieve any sort of success. And all of these kind of so-called intentions or aims and objectives from the outset of what this war was about to where we are now, with the kind of focus being around the Strait, it seems to be kind of changing by the week or by every 10 days. So I think Europe have played, actually, they've dodged a bullet literally there.
Dr. Bamo Nouri, great to pick your brain on this. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme and giving us your perspective. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, that brings